The Western mind has for centuries boggled at Russia.
Screaming in a desert, aka talking with no hope of anybody hearing you, is not productive at all. But sometimes you just have to do it in order to keep your sanity.
Slavs, now the largest ethno-linguistic group in Europe, started out in the worst position of any group in Europe. This is partly since trade was so much cheaper by water in the pre-industrial world, while the Slavs were as far as you could possibly be from the sea in Europe, starting in northern Ukraine and Belarus. This meant that even at the time of the Roman Empire, the Slavs were incredibly primitive, as the Romans just had no reason to interact with them.
Well then, Slavs indeed occupied large territories, but were not at all cut away from the sea. However, they frequently fought amongst each other, and such feuds were pretty bloody. Also, they were really interested in Eastern Roman Empire, aka Byzantium, which resulted in a number of wars, some of which Slavs won, in spite of being barbaric and more importantly, ever since 12th century Western Europe used Christian crusades as a way to conquer Eastern Europe. But Eastern Slavs and tribes like Lithuanians were never completely subjugated and eventually established their own countries. That is the reason why Russophobia was born. The mysterious Russian soul began as a way for Europeans to explain how can white people live without being Catholic. Such stereotypes, of course, apply to all Eastern Europeans, but the Russian case is the one best researched. Marshall Poe wrote a brilliant study about it called "Of People Born to Slavery." As Western society grew and changed, so did Russophobic narrative. Instead of filthy non-Catholics, Russians became filthy people subjugated and twisted by Asian influence.
The Slavs also sat at the edge of the Eurasian steppe, or a highway from which the most savage warriors in world history came from, with the Mongols or Huns being easy examples. Effectively, the early Slavs lived right next to a giant tiger natural park. Their entire society had evolved to fight off these tigers. These steppe peoples were also absolutely brutal and had no concept of humanity. If you want to look at pre-industrial atrocities or wars, these steppe tribes provide the vast majority of the bloodiest events.
Richard Pipes did some research on Asian influence on Russian society. The young man could have just turned to him. But no, we must make a racist argument. Here are those Asian monsters. They turned Russians into monsters as well. Atrocities uses language like the badass, unironically. It's not a history book. Its approach is very unscientific. It would make much more sense to divide all atrocities into battles, wars, crimes of economic nature, etc. But no, we have one war versus entire series of wars, like Times of Trouble, versus gladiator games, versus Atlantic slave trade. How would you combine it? Its numbers are shaky at best, and Matthew White admits it multiple times, especially in case of Chinggis Khan. Sometimes he's blatantly biased. For example, in case of Crusaders, he picks second lowest number without explaining it at all. Doesn't matter, Asians clearly have higher body count. Well, it does. If you take such estimates seriously, consider what it says about Chinese Empire. It was able to grow and develop in spite of such giant losses. This man will claim the Chinese system of governance is somehow inferior and less productive compared to European system. But let's get back to Eastern Slavs. So, 1230s. Eastern Slavs, stuck between Mongol Empire, has a reputation of subjugating everything in its path. Western Slavs, not a friendly neighbor, and Teft Northern, associated with Crusaders, aka people who destroyed Byzantine Empire just a few decades ago. To top it all off, Eastern Slavs are fighting amongst each other, constantly bringing in this fight some kind of third force, be it European kingdoms such as Hungary or Asian nomads. Eventually, they get subjugated.
Russia is also an example of how genetics don't perfectly drive history. Although we've proven that genetics does impact history and the world to a certain degree, there are mitigating examples like this. Russians are genetically not that different from West Europeans. Europe's genetic gradient is mostly south, not east-west. The genetic difference between Russians and Americans aren't massive, but it's harder to imagine.
Hold it, cowboy. What do you mean? Oh, so the genes aren't actually at fault. But how could this be? In all seriousness, some people, such as Ukrainian historian Mikhail Grushevsky or Adolf Hitler, did actually believe that Russians were some kind of Asian ethnicity. However, it still begs the question, why didn't Mongols wipe out Eastern Slavs? Or at least, assimilated them? This question inspired several conspiracy theories about the horde being a white country. Genghis Khan is described as having red hair and blue eyes after all.
I've made this video on how family structure informs society, where the collectivism of the Russian family structure and the authoritarian power it gives to fathers is very similar to China, thus creating a similar political structure to China. I've spoken about in previous videos how you can use a family structure to predict a society's political, cultural, and religious structure, since the family imprints what intuitively seems fair to the people in that society.
Where is the answer to an obvious question of assimilation? I had to cut out some parts, but it wasn't anything substantial. I guess he really just didn't notice the contradiction in his own words. Hey, Asians are evil, and Russians are evil. Russians were conquered by Asians. That must be why Russians are evil, because Russians are white people. Evil cannot be in their genes. Now let me show you that Russians are in fact evil by analyzing their social structure. On a side note, what is this map? Let's see. USA, Canada, large part of Britain, and Australia have an absolute nuclear family structure. Inheritance is entirely up to the decision of the parents involved. Pride and Prejudice begs to differ, so I guess it doesn't depict historic dynamics. Family structures. These societies view everyone as free individuals. Yup, clearly not historic. But then again, what does it say about Russia, Eastern Europe, Central? Why do they all have the same family structure? Men get wives out of clan and then live under the same roof as clan father. Ooh. Does this young man genuinely believe that that's how it is in Russia? And huge part of Europe, actually, not just Eastern Europe. What is this? How ignorant is he?
An important detail to throw in here is that the Russian peasants have never had property rights. Until 100 years ago, Russian villages held all their lands in common and would give out land to those who needed it. This led in two directions. Firstly, you can see why communism would intuitively make sense to this kind of people. Secondly, with no property rights, there was no incentive to work hard since you wouldn't keep any of it. It kept the average Russian desperately poor, while the upper classes, who could own property, have been very innovative and hardworking. If you look at Russian history, you see a small upper class which has achieved incredible results, while the majority population is largely in stasis. This is also driven by, and itself feeds into, the immense classism and inequality over Russian history. A reason the Russians have often been so advanced intellectually or artistically, but not economically or technologically, is that since Russia is so far removed from naval trade routes, but ideas can move really quickly by foot, but not stuff like industrial equipment.
Socialism as a movement was born in Western Europe, just like anarchism. The first evolution happened in France, and many of its key ideas would be called socialist now. The idea of overthrowing the ruling system, supposedly given by God, came out during Whatifalthist rebellion. Plato's perfect republic was all about shared property. Yet people like this young man will act as if the West has absolutely nothing to do with socialism or the dream of communism. Well, whatever. Russia did in fact develop a socialist system at some point, and socialism is still pretty influential in Russia, so let's discuss it. Wait! I've got distracted again. Let's get back to the question of Slavic population. The horde is indeed described as brutal and destroying cities, but it was not interested in the lands of Eastern Slavs. The horde's cause was to conquer all lands till the last sea. They were interested in the kingdom of Hungary and some of European lands, not in the lands of Eastern Slavs. In 1223, the rulers of southern Slavic lands, including Kiev, have united with the Kipchak tribe and attacked the horde in a battle known as the Battle of Kalka. To top it all off, they killed the horde's envoy sent to them with a peace offering, which in itself was grounds for vengeance, and vengeance they got. Several years later, the horde have invaded. Cities like Kiev, Chernigov, Galich, Volyn have now fully recovered their former influence. Daniel Galitsky, the last ruler of those lands not appointed by someone else, attempted to win back his independence by turning to the Roman Pope. Was crowned king, never received any substantial help. The horde quickly passed the dominion of these lands to someone else. Whom? Other Slavs. Western lands, such as Polotsk, joined forces with the Lithuanians and created their own joint state, independent from both Teuton Order and the horde. Northeastern lands were most troubled by the Teuton Order. Livonia was cutting them away from the sea. The Knights have seized Ijevsk, Pskov, nearly caused a trade blockade on Novgorod. Between Teuton Order and the horde, rulers of Novgorod chose the horde. It was started by Knyaz, aka Prince Yaroslav, but stipulated by his son Alexander, who was appointed by the horde as Knyaz of Vladimir and the supreme ruler of so-called Ulus Rus. Why couldn't Eastern Slavs just unite? Because of blood feuds, which didn't stop even during the horde's invasion. They hated each other more than they hated anyone else.
Part 2. The Tatar Yoke.
The Polish term. First used by Jan Dlugosh in 1497, then used by Matvey Mikhovsky in 1517, then passed to Western Europe, then to Russia in 19th century via the work of Christian Kruse.
The definitive founding moment of modern Russia is the conquest by the Mongols, or as the Russians and Europeans of that era called them, Tatars. If you want to look at the moment and impetus which created the Russian society of today, it's here. The Kievan Rus society, which formed under the Vikings, is to the modern Russians what the Romans are to the Western Europeans.
The nation their subjugated ancestors destroyed and later aspired to become for centuries? The horde would be a closer analogy. Not a complete one, but close one. Ancient Rus fell apart as early as 12th century, the beginning of 12th century. And at no point can it be compared to Roman Empire. Roman Empire left a giant impact on the world history. Ancient Rus did not. It had its moments, and it's a very important part of Eastern Slavic history as a whole, not to mention folklore. At its peak, it could easily match some of the best European kingdoms, but it still fell apart on its own, without any invasions. I do agree that the Horde's invasion was a crucial moment, but it didn't destroy the European nation. There was no nation to destroy.
You can definitely see continuity between, let's say, the Romans or Italians, but there is a difference. What happened is that the modern Belarusians and Ukrainians spent much more time being colonized by Poland, Lithuania, and the Russians by the Mongols. Thus, they evolved into different societies over time, although they were originally the same people.
Another weird map. Why is it 1450? The Horde have already fell apart by 1450. Why is Poland so small and Lithuania? Actually, Poland and Lithuania have not been united by 1450. Not yet. Where is Livonia? We actually have maps of 15th century. Was it too hard to find? I've already talked about the split, so I won't repeat myself. But I have to address the way in which it became a political point. Russia has historically presented itself as a defender of Orthodox Christians, not Russians specifically. But in some cases, appealing to race was simply more useful. Europeans understood this logic better. The status of the unifier was useful to Moscow for obvious reasons. However, the split was also used for opposing propaganda. For a couple of centuries now, some Ukrainian people, particularly Kiev's elites, like to suggest that Russia, by default, belongs to Ukraine because Ukraine has Kiev and Russia as a state is just a proxy created by Tatars. A great example of such thinking is modern Ukrainian politician Alexei Arestovich. That creates two conflicting narratives. One, Russia is a colony created by Tatars and should belong to Ukraine. Two, Ukraine is a colony created by Lenin and should know its place.
The Mongols are one of the most brutal conquerors ever in history, and Russia was the region in their large empire which was treated the worst.
Compared to what? Modern times? First of all, the Horde is not Mongol Empire. It's Oghuz Juchi, a part of Mongol Empire which quickly gained independence. Secondly, Russia was never part of the Horde. It was a vassal state of the Horde. Most Rus had to pay taxes. Partake in some military campaigns, it was negotiable, and its rulers had to be approved by the Khan of the Horde. In case of some kind of misbehavior, aka rebellion or tax evasion, the Horde used punishing raids, which was common practice for Middle Ages in general. That was pretty much it. Ever since early 14th century, the Mongols didn't even collect taxes themselves. It was done by Russian nobility. The Horde didn't try to assimilate or wipe out native population. It also didn't try to install its own nobility to rule over native population. Oghuz Rus kept its language, its currency, its social structure, its religion. The church was acknowledged and protected by the Horde. You could get executed for disrespecting it. It also didn't pay any taxes. In 1357, Metropolitan Alexei was summoned to the Horde for his healing prowess. He saved Aidula Khatun from turning blind. She had an eye disease. Or so the legend goes. I just wanted to show what kind of legends surround the relationship between Christian Church and the Horde. Russian merchants were allowed to trade with Europeans. How else could Novgorod keep its relations with the German cities? Russian merchants were also allowed to trade with the cities of the Horde. In 1269, Kurotai had ruled that nomads are not allowed to graze their cattle on lands occupied by cities or farmers. That included Oghuz Rus. Now let's compare it all to the Slavs conquered by Germans. You can easily do so by studying the history of Hansenwick. In 1170, German von Borsau joyfully writes, "Our God has graced his duke with joy and victory. Slavs are partly slain, partly exiled, their lands are seized. Now Germans can build cities and churches here." What he meant was Golstein and Brandenburg. In 1236, the Teuton Order had conquered Livonia and Estonia. The order had a bit of trouble with Prussians and was trying to subjugate them for half a century. Most of Prussian population, native population that is, was killed or deported. The new lands were populated by pilgrims from Silesia and central Germany. Since 1257 and up until 14th century, Slavs were not allowed to live even in Krakow, which wasn't even a Hanseatic city at that point. Need I remind you, those were initially Slavic territories. Stettin used to be a Slavic territory. Danzig used to be a Slavic territory, but Germans came and started colonizing. Danzig is modern Gdańsk. It's a Polish city. But in 14th century, less than 10% of its population consisted of Polish. What were the 90%? I think you can guess. And Polish actually managed to preserve most of their population. They just were drawn out of the cities to the countryside. In 14th century, the situation improved slightly. The Slavs were given the right of citizenship, but In 1309, the Teuton Order forbid to accept Slavs in the guilds. All of Western Slavs have accepted Catholicism and became really agitated towards Slavs who didn't practice it. Hence the conflict between Polish and Ukrainians. Some of Slavic nobility survived and was accepted by the Germans in exchange for loyalty, of course. Overall, can you really say the ancestors of modern Russians got the short end of the stick here? Both Russians and Polish were conquered by some invading force. Both had to eventually fight for their independence. Yet the West isn't interested in the mystery of Polish soul. Why? Oh, Asians brought their wicked government structure to Russia.
The difference here is that all authority in Russia flowed from top to bottom. In Russia, all the nobility were appointed by the Tsar to a certain region that they were supposed to protect. In Europe, as a comparison, the nobility came from an area and, over time, became entrenched in that region to push its self-interest against that of the centralized government.
Should have picked another picture. This one depicts Pereslavskaya Rada. People on the left are Russian representatives and Bogdan Khmelnytsky, leader of Kazakh separatists who asked Russian side to accept them as his subjects. Bogdan Khmelnytsky rebelled against Polish because he couldn't get any justice for himself. His house was destroyed by Polish noble. His wife, some say mistress, was kidnapped. His 8-year-old son killed. The court ruled in his favor, yet no repercussions followed. Because his opponent was Polish and he was not. He asked the king to interfere, the king sympathized with him, but didn't do anything. This event had many other reasons, of course, and it is highly controversial right now, but it's not a good illustration of European nobility. As for nobility status, I want to make one thing clear. When we are talking about private property on land, in any feudal society, we are talking about the rights of nobility. Commoners could never own land in feudal society. That was the entire point of feudal society. And even for them it carried some restrictions. After all, vassal got his feud for serving his lord. So technically, those were the lands of his lord, not his. Plus, regional differences. You cannot really tell me that England and France had the same views when it came to land ownership. But let me get back to Russia. Private property on land was the main reason behind endless blood feuds between Eastern Slavs. As the Rurikid dynasty grew, there were fewer and fewer lands which they could divide amongst their children. Adding confusing inheritance laws and unstable political situation, and you get a dynasty which is constantly at each other's throats. Since they all saw each other as equal, there could be no talk of uniting Russia because it demanded that somebody would become the main lord and pass it to his son, ignoring all of his brothers, uncles, etc. Uniting Russia meant getting rid of private property of highest nobility. The serving nobility, boyare, managed to keep their lands. Or at least that was the logic of Moscow's branch. There was a problem, however. Somebody needed to rule over cities and neighboring territories. Boyare could not own them. The highest nobility was stripped of the right to own them, so governors were appointed by Tsar or the Great Knyaz. In Europe, as far as I know, the cities would be the property of the lord who owned the lands they were located on. The Russian system indeed could have been inspired by the Horde system, which was part of the Mongolian system, which was inspired by the Chinese bureaucratic system. Then again, Mongolian Empire had Kurutai, which was electing the Great Khan. Russia had no such bodies except for times of crisis. I'm bringing this up to showcase that elections is not just a European thing. Chinese system was great, according to Matthew White. Look how much it survived. So what was so bad about Russian system?
Russia is the continental-sized country in the world that has the least important regional differences.
He doesn't know about Russian national republics? Maybe he means something else. Let's see. I've never really seen regional differences be meaningful in Russian history except the Cossack revolts in the 1600s and 1700s. I wish he would specify the dates, but I guess he means the rebellion of Stepan Razin and the rebellion of Emelian Pugachev, which weren't really about the regional differences. It was about the commoners rebelling against taxes and such stuff. Actually, a lot of non-Russians joined those revolts, like Soviet UI, for example. In America, the country was formed as a federation between competing regional blocs, so it's about economy now. China has so many local languages and ethnic groups with long periods of disunity, so we're back to ethnicities now. Russia has all of that as well. India hasn't been united for most of its history and is so diverse. Shouldn't he know about wars in Chechnya at least? Actually, he should have seen the map of Russian Empire. How much of its territories belong to Russian Federation right now? I see nothing comparable to this in Russian history where the dynamic is Moscow dominating the rest. So he doesn't even know that St. Petersburg was Russian capital for more than 2 centuries. Fascinating. It almost feels like a praise, even though his entire point is that Russia is this ultimate white supremacy state where everyone thinks the same, looks the same, and feels the same because all of local differences were wiped out by the superior central power. That is actually pretty funny if you compare it to the Russophobia of 19th and 20th century. Those times when people like Tuhinsky from Kiev or Adolf Hitler called Russians a subhuman race created by interracial breed.
An interesting fact here is that a significant amount of the ancestry for the Russian nobility is in Tatar origin, more so than the peasants actually. This might be another factor pushing the classism in Russian history.
Ah, so Tatars just died out like dinosaurs but left a trace in Russian nobility. In Russian, Tatars ruled over Tatars. Kalmyks ruled over Kalmyks. Bashkirs ruled over Bashkirs. Russians ruled over Russians. There was a loophole, however. Russia traditionally put religion above nationality or race. So let's say if Tatar was converted into Christianity, he would basically become Russian. However, such families typically went for interracial marriages and soon turned out to be white, so it's hard to imagine them holding any racist beliefs against general Russian population. And what about Russian subjects who were not ethnically Russian? Tatars, Bashkirs, Kalmyks, Buryats, Yakuts, etc. Once again, this theory only works if you consider Russia a white country with no regional differences. Which this young man does, so of course it makes sense to him. Interestingly, even since Bertrand III, all Russian emperors were ethnically German. The peak of serfdom when Russian peasants were equal to private property happened under Catherine II, a foreigner from Stettin. We're talking about nobility, right? In 1875, Russian scientist Nikolai Zagoskin published his study about the ancestry of Russian nobility. 18.3% were descendants of Rurik, 4.6% were Russians not related to Rurik, 24.3% were Polish or Lithuanian, 25% Western Europeans, 17% Tatars and other Eastern ethnicities, 10.5% not stated. So who was oppressing poor Russians? For some reason, by pure coincidence, most of Russian classical literature carries anti-Western sentiment. One of the most obvious examples being War and Peace by Lev Tolstoy. The whole point of this book is Russian nobility realizing that it's in fact Russian nobility, not French. And the book has an entire passage that's dedicated solely to bashing the French and West in general.
Russian government purposely tried to tamper down economic growth, with them keeping towns from growing beyond a certain length. Or also, they burned the prosperous merchant city of Novgorod.
Because who needs taxes, right? Also, this is the siege of Ryazan by Batu's horde. There are paintings about the siege of Novgorod, but I guess they were not dramatic enough. Novgorod was taken 2 times, by Ivan III and Ivan IV. Ivan III acted as a typical feudal lord of his time, and 2 centuries later, actually, it was still accurate. He held dominion over a city. The city tried to rebel and proclaim itself independent. He attacked the city. How many times was the city of Braunschweig being attacked by the Dukes of Braunschweig? I mentioned 2 centuries for a reason. Braunschweig was completely taken in 17th century, 200 years after Ivan IV set siege to Novgorod. As for Ivan IV, he was punished in Novgorod for treason. Tsar attempted to conquer Livonia, particularly the city of Narva, which he planned to turn into Russian port. For Russia overall it could be beneficial, but for Novgorod itself tragic, because it was losing its trade significance. Novgorod elite supposedly conspired with Lithuanian king, aka Polish king, since they were united already at the time, and decided to betray Russia. Yes, destroying a city because of the deeds of its elites is cruel, I'm not denying it, but it was the norm of the time. European monarchs were not above it. It's not a specific Russian trait. As for the government preventing cities from growing, I wonder how it could be done. By wiping out the extra population? How was it determined? Where can I find this data? And why would it be done? Aside from Russian government being cartoonishly evil, of course. The Russian cities were bound by the wall, aka Kremlin. When the population was becoming too big for it to hold, people started settling outside, which created a huge set of problems for the city. This is it. I guess it's time to conclude the Asian influence part. So, to wrap it up, the Horde's invasion was brutal and destroyed a lot of cities. The Horde's method of governance had greatly influenced the government of Russia. In the end, Russia became an independent country, which conquered most of its neighbors, withstood all of the numerous threats it faced, and eventually became one of the most powerful countries in the world. Compare it to the history of Baltic states or Native American tribes. That should tell you all you need to know about the wicked Asian influence.
This is the biggest issue in Russia today, in that there is more Russian money outside Russia than inside it, since the wealthy try to predate upon the country and then get it outside to Cyprus, Panama, or London where it's safe ASAP. The Russian economy is dominated by these giant industries, which are run by oligarchs, while the economy doesn't allow competition. If you went back to Russia 500 years ago, it would look pretty similar.
In other words, 500 years ago, Russia was ruled by evil nomads who burned down cities just for fun. And now Russia is also ruled by evil uncivilized nomads who won't let any businesses develop because they hate civilization and capitalism. Poor Russian oligarchs have to create offshores and launder their money. This is not an attempt to evade taxes, it's just a fear of an oppressive Russian government. You could not even think about something like that happening in the USA. USA, a true democratic, true Western nation, the heart of all justice and freedom, keeps its businesses closed. In all seriousness, how is Detroit doing? Actually, forget about Detroit. What about American industry as a whole? Was it moved to China because paying wages to good-natured, hard-working American people was too expensive in the eyes of American businessmen? What about American nuclear sector being in the dump because relying on Russian uranium exports was cheaper? What about USA not being able to take care of its own nuclear arsenal? What about American infrastructure being in such a poor shape that trains are going off the rail every month? Why didn't businessmen take care of that? What about the Pentagon hiring Russian coders because they are cheaper and ignoring how it puts the entire USA in danger? A proud American boy has no business boasting about economy. His country's economy is supported by two things, the dollar and the weapon industrial complex. But I guess I should address his point. Offshoring is a new thing for Russia. Bourgeoisie is not. Russia had its fair share of rich people who were not born into nobility. The famous painter Ayvazovsky was born in an Armenian family. Eventually became so rich that he could allow himself to sponsor the building of a railroad. The Stroganov family, historians still argue where did they came from, but they basically built the industry in Ural Mountains. The Yunusov family, 2 factories, 60 shops, came from Tatar peasants. The Tretyakov family came from private serfs. The Tretyakov brothers eventually became so rich that they started to collect paintings, forming the famous Tretyakov Gallery. Those are just the few I can come up with on the top of my head. The USSR indeed had a different system. The head of the factory did not own it, he was appointed there and had to prove his worth. Many Russians today actually feel nostalgic about this system. Many of Russian oligarchs did not build any successful business empires or even businesses at all. They privatized the result of the labor of other people via illegal schemes. And they were desperately afraid of Russian government one day bringing them to justice. They were not afraid of their Western patrons. Now, Western sanctions teach them a lesson. Thankfully, Russian economy does seem to be recovering now and is actually growing. Yes, it's still energy oriented. Yes, the energy sector is dominated by corporations, while extortion building nuclear plants is expensive. Small businesses cannot do it. On the plus side, Gazprom and Rosatom pay their taxes, and those taxes are a significant part of Russian budget. This money goes into Russian economy and finance supporting measures for small businesses. I'm not calling this system perfect, but if it didn't work at all and Russian economy was hopeless, Russia would simply not exist. But I suppose since the pity party is over, now this young man has nothing else to do but to dunk on the political adversary. So, what next? Religion?